On a rainy roadside, a soaked cardboard box lay forgotten. Inside it, a tiny golden puppy, barely breathing, left behind by a world that didn't care. But one man stopped, a man who had lost almost everything, except the part of him still willing to hope. What began that night wasn't just a rescue, it was the start of something none of them saw coming. Please like and subscribe, and stay with us to follow the rest of this heartfelt story. It was early spring in Bend, Oregon, a town cradled by pine forests and volcanic rock, where the Deschutes River cuts through the land like a shimmering blue thread. The snow had only recently melted, revealing patches of green along the banks. A gentle wind moved through the tall fir trees, carrying the scent of earth and river moss. Clouds lingered lazily in the pale sky, casting soft shadows across the historic Maplewood Bridge, an old wooden structure built decades ago, weathered but still used by hikers and bikers traversing the Deschutes River Trail. On this particular afternoon, Caleb Jennings was out walking with his newly adopted puppy. Caleb was 11 years old, with sun-freckled cheeks, chestnut curls sticking out from under his blue hoodie, and a quiet demeanor that came not from shyness, but from a deep well of thoughtfulness. He was the kind of child who preferred sketching birds over video games, who asked questions like, "Do rivers remember?" and "Why do dogs always forgive?" Sunny, the 4-month-old golden retriever by his side, had quickly become Caleb's constant shadow. With fluffy butter-colored fur and wide, trusting brown eyes, Sunny still moved with the clumsy energy of a puppy, ears too large for his headtail, wagging at everything from butterflies to falling leaves. He had a small white streak on his left paw, and a barely visible scar on his belly from a surgery he had as a newborn. Sunny had been rescued from a shelter 3 weeks earlier, just after Caleb's father was deployed overseas. A silence Caleb tried to fill with the sound of paws and soft barks. They had made it halfway across the Maplewood Bridge when it happened. A man on a mountain bike dressed in bright orange lycra and moving far too fast for the narrow wooden path shouted out a warning too late. "Heads up." He called his tires screeching against the boards. The shout startled Sunny, who had been sniffing a loose nail in one of the planks. In an instant, the pup jerked his head up. His leash slipped from Caleb's hand, and he bolted sideways directly toward the open edge, where a section of railing had broken away years ago and never been replaced. Sunny Caleb screamed, but it was too late. The world slowed. There was a blur of fur, a yelp that tore through the quiet afternoon, and then silence. The small body plummeted down, vanishing into the swirling waters of the Deschutes River 30 meters below. Caleb's knees hit the bridge as his breath vanished. The cyclist skidded to a halt, muttering curses before realizing what had just occurred. His expression turned pale, and he dismounted but didn't approach Caleb. Instead, he backed away slowly, disappearing down the trail. Meanwhile, a man paddling a dark green kayak on the river below had witnessed everything. His name was Mason Rivera, a 26-year-old environmental biology graduate student from Oregon State University. Mason had a lean, athletic build, sun-darkened skin, and shaggy black hair usually tucked under a faded baseball cap. He had always been more at home on the river than in lecture halls, and his professors often said he could identify more bird calls than he could human faces. Raised by his grandmother after losing both parents in a car accident when he was 12, Mason had learned early that silence wasn't something to fear, it was something to observe. He had been conducting a solo wildlife survey on river otters when he looked up and saw the pup fall. For a split second, he doubted his own eyes. Then, without hesitation, Mason dipped his paddle and steered directly into the current. "Hang on, little guy," he muttered, heart-pounding. The water was moving fast, fed by the spring melt. Rocks loomed ahead. It was a gauntlet. Sunny hit the river with a splash that disappeared beneath a surge of foam. Mason followed the direction of the fall, cutting across the current with deft, practiced strokes. Come on," he whispered. Then just ahead, something caught his eye, a swirl in the water and a flash of gold. Sunny was floating motionless, his body buffeted by the current, toward a downed tree with splintered branches like jagged spears. But a strange thing happened. Just as Sunny neared the deadly branches, a smaller log half submerged, and seemingly moving against the current, slid between the puppy and the tree, acting like a barrier. It gently nudged Sunny into a calmer eddy where Mason managed to reach him. He scooped the puppy out of the water with both arms, cradling the limp form against his chest. "You're okay," he said aloud, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Sunny or to himself. Mason paddled ashore and rushed the puppy to the small veterinary clinic located a few blocks from the river. Dr. Sarah Whitmore was on duty that day. In her early 50s, Sarah was tall and wiry with streaks of silver in her tied-back auburn hair and a gentle but no-nonsense air about her. A former ER vet in San Francisco, she had moved to Bend after losing her husband to cancer, hoping for a quieter life, surrounded by animals instead of sirens. She was known to be deeply intuitive, often sensing what was wrong with her patients before tests confirmed it. She met Mason at the back entrance of the clinics, took one look at Sonny, and snapped into action. "Bring him in, towel heating pad oxygen," she instructed her assistant. As Mason explained what had happened, Sarah checked vitals and ran quick scans. Caleb arrived soon after, still trembling, accompanied by his grandmother, June Jennings, a soft-spoken librarian with a steel spine hidden behind her reading glasses and floral cardigans. To everyone's shock, Sonny had no broken bones, no internal bleeding, no punctures, just superficial scratches and mild hypothermia. Sarah looked at Mason, then Caleb. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "He fell from over 100 feet. That log," Mason murmured. "It moved upstream, protected him." Sarah didn't respond right away. She was too experienced to jump to conclusions. But something in her eyes softened. She reached down and stroked Sonny's damp head. "You're meant to be here, aren't you, sweetheart?" That night, Mason stayed by Sonny's side. Caleb, after some hesitation, handed Mason the dog's worn red leash. "He likes you," the boy whispered. "He was never scared of you." And Mason, who had spent years believing that silence was the only way to survive, sat in the quiet clinic, listening to the rhythm of a small heartbeat beside him, and for the first time in years, felt something shift. The sun rose the next morning over Bend, Oregon, painting the eastern ridge in pale gold. Mist clung to the surface of the Deschutes River, swirling like whispered secrets around the rocks, where the current had nearly claimed a young life the day before. Inside the quiet veterinary clinic on Elm Street, the world was just beginning to stir, but in one small recovery room, the rhythm of breath and hope had never stopped. Sonny lay curled on a thick fleece blanket, his golden fur now clean, and fluffed his body warm thanks to a carefully regulated heating pad tucked beneath him. A soft, beeping monitor tracked his pulse, each beat steady and strong. At the edge of the cot sat Mason Rivera, chin resting on his fist, still in yesterday's damp flannel shirt. He hadn't left. He couldn't not, after what he'd seen. Not after the way the little dog had fought to stay afloat, with something far stronger than instinct. It was will. "Doctor." Sarah Whitmore entered quietly, her long white coat brushing her calves, stethoscope tucked into her inner pocket. She looked like she hadn't slept, though her eyes were calm. Years of emergency care had taught her that miracles needed more than luck. They needed observation, patience, and a refusal to give up. "Vitals are steady," she said, as she leaned down, fingers brushing behind Sonny's ears. "You might have a guardian wrapped in golden fur." Mason gave a tired laugh, then straightened. "I didn't think he'd make it through the night." Sarah nodded, then stood, arms folded. "Neither did I. But this dog's tougher than most." A knock came from the main entrance. It was June Jennings, Caleb's grandmother, bundled in her forest green coat, a canvas tote slung over her shoulder. Her thick gray curls framed her lined but lively face. With her was Caleb, wearing the same hoodie from yesterday, the sleeves still damp at the cuffs. In his hand, he clutched a small spiral-bound notebook, his journal. "Is he awake?" the boy asked, voice barely above a whisper. "He's resting, but you can sit with him," Sarah said, giving Caleb a small, reassuring nod. Caleb stepped into the room like entering a church. He knelt by Sonny, whispering his name, and after a moment the puppy stirred, his ears twitching. Then, with visible effort, Sonny lifted his head and nudged Caleb's knee with his nose. He remembers. Caleb breathed, eyes wide. Sarah turned to June. "No fractures, no internal injuries, just superficial abrasions and mild hypothermia. It's improbable." June arched an eyebrow. "But not impossible. I've seen enough to know better than to label everything." Sarah replied, lips twitching at the corners. Mason, who had been silent, finally spoke. "Something strange happened yesterday. There was this log. It moved against the current, almost like it blocked him from hitting the branches. I can't explain it." Sarah glanced at him. "I don't think we have to yet, but we'll keep watching." Later that afternoon, Mason helped Sarah in the back room of the clinic, organizing bandages and filing supplies. Though not a vet, he had the hands of someone comfortable around the injured, slow, precise, respectful. That's when the doorbell chimed and a teenage girl stepped inside. She wore a hand-knitted beanie and oversized denim jacket patched with embroidered daisies. Her name was Talia Green, 17, an intern from the local high school who volunteered part-time after school. Talia had warm brown skin, almond-shaped hazel eyes, and the kind of calm energy that made animals trust her instantly. She had struggled with anxiety since middle school and found comfort in caring for creatures that couldn't speak their pain. Sarah had taken her under her wing. Mrs. Whitmore, the shelter, called. Someone dropped off a litter of kittens in a box by the dumpsters again. "They're bringing them over," Talia said. Sarah sighed, brushing her bangs out of her face. "Let's prepare the isolation unit. Mason, can you help Talia bring the cages from storage together?" Mason and Talia prepared a warm space for the kittens. By the time the shelter van arrived, Sonny had perked up enough to watch curiously from his blanket. The driver handed over a cardboard box lined with an old shirt. Inside were 3 tiny kittens' eyes, barely open, shivering. Talia gently lifted each one, checking for injury. "They're so cold," she murmured. But Sonny did something odd. He stood unsteady but purposeful and walked toward the table. He stopped beside the box and sniffed, then let out a single soft bark. Talia looked at him. "What's he doing?" Sarah entered and watched. Sonny sat and stared at the smallest kitten, a frail calico barely larger than a fist. It wasn't moving. Then Sonny gave a low whine, pawing at the table leg. Talia's brow furrowed. "Wait, this one's not breathing right." She lifted the calico and felt its chest. "It's barely there." Sarah jumped into action, taking the kitten to a heated incubator and administering drops of glucose and oxygen. Moments later, the kitten's paws twitched. Everyone stared at Sonny. Caleb, standing in the doorway with June, whispered he knew. That night, Mason returned home for the first time in 2 days. His house was a small, weather-beaten cottage at the edge of town, filled with books on ecosystems, animal cognition, and old photographs of his mother smiling beside rivers. He lay awake for hours replaying the events in his head, the fall, the log, the bark at the kitten. Back at the clinic, Sarah sat in her office tapping notes into her tablet. Subject, Sonny. Recovery exceeding expectations. Unusual behavioral responses observed. Will continue monitoring. She paused, then added, possible early signs of heightened sensory perception. In the quiet of the recovery room, Sonny slept curled beside Caleb, who had begged to stay a little longer. June had agreed, sitting just outside the door, with her knitting, smiling to herself, as she listened to her grandson whisper stories into the golden dog's ear. And through the night, the soft, steady hum of breath filled the room, not just of one life restored, but of something new beginning to bloom. The following week in Bend brought crisp morning air and skies painted in watercolor hues, pink drifting into blue with streaks of orange as if nature itself was gently shaking off winter's hold. Along the Deschutes River, the trees were budding and the breeze smelled of cedar and new beginnings. At Elm Street Veterinary Clinic, life was returning to normal, or at least what passed for normal, after a puppy survived a fall that should have been fatal and proceeded to predict the revival of a nearly dead kitten. Sonny had been cleared for discharge, and Caleb was more excited than he let on. The little golden dog had become his world, a constant presence now, trotting beside him with a bounce in every step. Sonny was healthy, joyful, and yet different. Caleb noticed it first, but he didn't say anything until the 3rd day home. It happened when they were playing in the backyard. Caleb had tossed an old tennis ball across the lawn. Sonny, as expected, chased it, but suddenly stopped halfway and turned toward the front door, ears pricked, tail wagging. Seconds later, the doorbell rang. Caleb opened the door to find a delivery man standing there with a package for June. The dog hadn't heard a car pull in. He hadn't seen the man. Yet he had known. At first, Caleb chalked it up to chance, but it happened again. And again. One afternoon, Caleb's cousin Liam visited. Just as June brought in lemonade, Sonny let out a single bark, then walked to the phone stand, sat down, and stared at it. The phone rang 3 seconds later. "That's weird," Liam said, raising an eyebrow. He was 15 with unruly hair and a skateboard always within reach. "You sure he's not reading your grandma's mind?" Caleb shrugged, but the unease in his chest grew. It wasn't just the doorbell or the phone. It was the dreams. Sonny had started barking softly in his sleep, whimpering, pawing at the air. One night, Caleb was awakened by the sound of claws on hardwood. He found Sonny in the hallway, facing the front door, stiff and alert. Nothing was there, but 20 minutes later, a car crashed 2 blocks away, waking the neighborhood. That morning, Caleb told June everything. June sat with him on the porch swing, a thick-knit shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Some dogs have instincts, she said carefully, and some have something else. I don't think you're imagining things, Caleb. Caleb bit his lip. You don't think it's bad, right? Like, wrong? No, sweet boy? Sometimes the world gives a voice to the quietest hearts. The next day at school, Caleb brought his journal. During lunch, while other kids swapped Pokemon cards, he wrote down every odd behavior Sonny had displayed, time-stamped and detailed. He didn't realize someone was reading over his shoulder until a soft voice piped up. "Does your dog always do that?" Caleb turned to see a girl in his class, Mira Delgado. She was new, having moved from Santa Fe 3 months prior. Mira had long, jet-black hair, usually braided into 2 ropes, skin the color of burnt sugar, and wide, curious eyes that seemed to notice things others didn't. She was quiet, but never afraid to speak up, and kids often said she talked to animals like they were old friends. "My cat does something like that." She continued, "He always meows before my mom gets a phone call." Caleb looked down at his notes. "Maybe they hear stuff we don't. Or feel stuff," Mira said, tapping her chest. "In here." That evening, Caleb invited Mira over with June's permission. Mira arrived with a tote bag full of pet treats and a sketchbook she refused to show anyone. When Sonny came to greet her, he paused, then gently licked her fingers and leaned against her legs like they'd met before. "He likes you," Caleb said, surprised. "I know," she replied simply. They sat in the backyard under the maple tree while Sonny chased falling petals. Mira pulled out her sketchbook, finally letting Caleb see. Page after page was filled with drawings of animals, not just how they looked, but how they felt. One showed a rabbit surrounded by dark scribbles, but with a glowing heart in its chest. Another was of a cat leaping toward a sunbeam made of stars. "I draw what they show me," Mira whispered. Inside, June watched them from the window, a warm smile on her lips and a slight furrow in her brow. The world was changing around Caleb, and somehow she sensed it wasn't only about a gifted dog, it was something larger unfolding. The final confirmation came 3 days later. A storm was building, low thunder rumbling across the horizon. June had gone to the library where she still volunteered. Caleb and Sonny stayed home. As the sky darkened, Caleb noticed Sonny pacing restlessly. His ears kept twitching. Then, without warning, he ran to the side door and began barking furiously. Caleb opened it and saw nothing. "What is it, boy?" Sonny ran into the alley between their house and the neighbors, barking louder. Caleb followed and found a garbage bag lying near the fence, twitching slightly. He stepped closer and recoiled at the smell. The bag moved. Inside, wrapped in a blanket, was a kitten barely alive. Someone had abandoned it in the storm. Caleb ran inside, grabbing a towel and a box, then called the clinic. 15 minutes later, Sarah welcomed them at the back door. She quickly took the kitten, who was dehydrated and suffering from early hypothermia. Mira, who had just arrived to drop off her sketchbook, helped wrap the kitten in warming pads. Sarah looked at Sonny. He found another one. Caleb nodded. He knew. Sarah exchanged glances with Mira. Then she said softly, "We may need to start documenting this more officially." Back home, Caleb opened his journal and gave it a title, Sonny's Sight. He didn't understand it yet, but something about Sonny was shifting, becoming more than just instinct, more than timing. He was sensing the world's secrets before they were spoken, and somehow, Caleb felt he was supposed to witness it all. The morning fog rolled softly through the woods on the outskirts of Bend, where the town thinned into whispering pines and moss-covered trails. The trees here stood like solemn witnesses to time, and nestled among them was a small cedar cabin with a sagging porch and a gently humming wind chime shaped like a crescent moon. This was Mason Rivera's home, a quiet refuge where silence wasn't emptiness, but breath. Mason sat on the front steps with a steaming mug of coffee, eyes drifting over the misty landscape. His black hair was still damp from a shower falling loosely over his brow. The lines around his eyes, deep for a man of 26, had been carved not by age, but by loss. His flannel shirt hung open over a faded t-shirt, bearing the logo of a forgotten indie band. On the steps beside him, Sonny dozed with his head resting on Mason's boot, rising and falling with the dog's gentle breaths. They had begun spending mornings together like this, ever since Sonny had recovered from his fall and demonstrated those inexplicable abilities. Mason had grown closer to him, not just as a rescuer, but as someone trying to understand what it all meant. It had been years since Mason had let anyone into his life. After the accident that took both his parents when he was 12, he had gone to live with his grandmother, Celia Rivera, a woman who read poetry aloud while baking cornbread and never turned down a stray animal. She passed away the year he started college, and though Mason finished his degree in environmental biology, he hadn't returned to the world fully. Instead, he found solitude in the wilderness among streams and birdsong, avoiding conversations that required more than nods and weather talk. But Sonny was different. He didn't ask questions. He just listened. Mason leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You feel things," he said quietly to Sonny. "Like me, I guess, but stronger." The dog opened one eye, tail flicking softly. Later that morning, Mason stopped by the clinic. Sarah Whitmore greeted him with her usual half-smile. She was rearranging a shelf of canine supplements, her lab coat rolled at the sleeves, a pencil stuck behind one ear. She was the kind of woman who wore grief like a thread in her clothing, present subtle, never overpowering. Her husband's death to cancer years ago had marked her, but it hadn't broken her. Instead, she poured herself into her work, into every animal that limped through her door. "Mason," she said, without turning, "here to check on the miracle dog?" He smiled faintly. "Just wanted to ask if I could help out again." "Volunteering. I've got the time." Sarah raised an eyebrow, then nodded slowly. "We could use the help. Talia's out this week, family emergency." She didn't mention that Talia's younger brother had been hospitalized after a severe asthma attack. Mason already knew. The town was small, and kindness traveled fast in places like this. In the storage room, Mason began organizing medical supplies. As he worked, Mira arrived with Caleb. Mira, with her braids wrapped in a scarf dotted with moons, waved silently before heading to check on the foster kittens. Caleb trailed behind, flipping through his growing journal, now titled Sonny's Sight, Volume 1. "Hey, Mason," Caleb said. "We were thinking, maybe you could help us record everything Sonny's done, like scientifically. You know, data." Mason turned intrigued. "Like a case study." "Exactly," Mira chimed in from the kitten room. "We can cross-reference it with moon phases, weather, electromagnetic stuff, anything." Mason looked between them, hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but we'll need structure, controls, observational logs." Mira grinned. "That's your thing, right? Structure used to be?" He replied more to himself than them. Over the next few days, they created a routine. Mason would meet the kids after school at the clinic, where Sonny was now a sort of unofficial therapy dog. They'd track his reactions to specific stimuli, sound frequencies, light flashes, even subtle scent changes. Mira brought in crystals and strange tuning forks her aunt swore were energy activators. Mason, skeptical but respectful, took notes all the same. But what caught Mason most off guard wasn't Sonny's responses. It was how Caleb watched him. "You used to be different, huh?" the boy asked one afternoon. Mason blinked. "What do you mean?" "You walk like someone who forgot how to be in a group, but you still want to." The words hit Mason harder than he expected. He didn't reply, but Caleb didn't seem to need one. He just sat beside him, silent as a tree. That evening, Mason returned home and pulled out an old cardboard box from the closet. Inside were his grandmother's journals, yellowed photo albums, and a leather-bound notebook he hadn't opened in years. It was filled with his own sketches of eagles, wolves, waves, but the last page had a drawing of a small dog curled beneath a maple tree, dated 2 weeks before he found Sonny. He didn't remember drawing it. Back at the clinic, Sarah noticed a change in Mason. He stayed longer, spoke more, smiled without looking down. She didn't mention it. She just handed him another clipboard and let it happen. But everything shifted on Friday. It began with Sonny barking at a cabinet in the back hallway. At first they thought he'd found a mouse, but his barks weren't angry, they were anxious. He paced in circles, then barked again, pointing his nose toward the old medicine shelf. Sarah opened it. Behind a stack of expired syringes was a heating pad, plugged in, slightly frayed and dangerously overheating. The cord was melting against the wall, a fire hazard, A few more minutes and the clinic could have caught fire. Sarah unplugged it quickly, heart racing. He knew she whispered. Mason stared at Sonny, who now sat calmly, tail wagging. That night, as they all gathered on the front steps of the clinic, watching the stars blink into the velvet sky, Mason finally spoke what had been stirring in him since the day on the bridge. "I think he was sent," he said, voice low. "Not just for Caleb, or you, but for all of us." Sonny rested his head on Mason's knee, as if in quiet agreement. The first lightning of spring rolled across Bend like a slow drumbeat echoing through the mountains. Heavy clouds cloaked the sky in layers of blue-gray, and by late afternoon, a steady rain had begun to fall, drumming gently on rooftops and leaves. The town slowed down. Cafes flicked on their warm yellow lights, and the scent of wet pavement and pine filled the air. Inside the Jennings home, Caleb sat by the living room window, with Sonny resting his head on the windowsill. The little dog's ears twitched at every shift in thunder, but it wasn't fear, it was listening. Pure, alert stillness. "Do you hear something?" Caleb asked. Sonny didn't move, but then he got up tail stiff and walked to the back door. Not barking, not whining, just waiting. June in the kitchen brewing chamomile tea noticed. "What's he doing?" "I don't know," Caleb said, already slipping on his raincoat. Outside, the rain was heavier, soft and cool. Sonny walked with purpose toward the trail behind their house that led toward Pine Hollow Park. Caleb followed. They crossed the open field behind the tennis courts through a line of elderberry bushes and into a wooded section that most kids rarely explored. It was here beneath the dripping trees that Sonny stopped and began sniffing the air, then sprinted forward through the underbrush. Caleb's heart raced as he chased after him. They found her near the edge of the park's pond. A girl no older than 10 lay unconscious on the muddy grass, soaked through her lips, slightly blue. Sonny stood over her barking with short, sharp urgency. Caleb dropped beside her and shook her shoulder. Hey, are you okay?" "Nothing." Then he saw the medical bracelet on her wrist. "Epilepsy. In case of seizure, call 911. Caleb's voice cracked as he called emergency services, giving the location as best as he could through chattering teeth. Sonny curled up beside the girl, licking her cheek gently, his body shielding hers from the wind. The paramedics arrived within minutes. The lead responder, a tall woman named Casey Marsh, mid-30s, wiry and efficient, had kind brown eyes behind rain-flecked glasses. "How long was she out?" "I don't know," Caleb said. "But my dog found her. He just knew." Casey glanced at Sonny and gave a low whistle. "Smart dog." They transported the girl to the hospital, where she later recovered without complications. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Avery, both school teachers, were overwhelmed with gratitude. Her name was Layla. She had wandered from the path during a family walk while chasing a butterfly, and a seizure had struck before anyone noticed. News of the rescue spread quickly. By the next day, the Bend Bulletin ran a front-page photo of Sonny, sitting proudly with Caleb and Mason, at the clinic steps, captioned "Golden Retriever Saves Local Girl in Storm." But Mason, reading the article aloud at the clinic, frowned thoughtfully. "It's not just smarts, there's something else." Sarah, prepping a dose of dewormer for a senior dog in the next room, poked her head out. "You're not wrong, I've been thinking about his heart." "What do you mean?" Mira asked, brushing dirt off her jeans from earlier kennel work. Sarah pulled out a medical file and placed a printout of Sonny's post-rescue scans on the counter. His cardiovascular response patterns, they spike in situations before the actual stimulus occurs. Like, he anticipates emotional and physiological distress. Mason looked up. "Like an empathic map, or bioelectric sensitivity," Sarah said. "Some studies have hinted that animals can pick up on changes in biochemical energy before visible signs appear. Like dogs detecting seizures," Mira offered. Sarah nodded. "Yes, but this is broader. It's like Sonny connects to emotion itself." The group fell silent, the air in the room crackling with a new kind of understanding. It was no longer a question of odd coincidence or a smart rescue. Sonny was responding to something deeper, something invisible. That evening, while the clinic emptied out, Mason stayed behind with Caleb and Sonny. They reviewed Caleb's logbooks, now thick with observations. Mira joined them after her violin lesson, her case slung over her shoulder. They sat in the staff room, the table cluttered with papers, dog treats, and mugs of cocoa. "I think we should test emotional proximity," Mira suggested. Like, see if he reacts when someone's heart is hurting, even if they don't say anything. Mason hesitated. That's not an easy variable to track, but it might explain why he goes to people who haven't even spoken, Caleb added. Remember the kitten and Layla. They decided to try something. Mira asked her cousin Ava, who had recently lost her childhood cat, to stop by the clinic the next day under the pretense of needing dog food. They wouldn't tell Sonny anything. Just observe. The next day, Ava came in quietly. She was 19, with pale skin hair, dyed a soft lavender, and dressed in a charcoal hoodie. She rarely made eye contact and mumbled her way through, asking for some flea shampoo. Sonny, lying by the front desk, suddenly lifted his head, walked to her, and gently placed a paw on her shoe. Ava froze. Then her eyes filled with tears. I didn't tell anyone, she whispered, but I haven't been able to stop crying at night. I keep thinking I'll hear Poppy's purr. Mason and Sarah exchanged glances. No one had said a word, no signals, no cues. Sonny simply knew. That night, as rain tapped again on rooftops, Mason walked home alone, deep in thought. He paused halfway, staring at the dark horizon beyond the trees. When he reached his cabin, he sat beside Sonny on the floor and whispered, "Whatever you are, you're not here just to feel. You're here to help us remember how to." Sonny looked up, then pressed his nose gently against Mason's chest. A soft spark, a quiet moment. A connection not built of words but of hearts remembering how to reach each other. The sun returned to bend in full pouring light across the rooftops and rippling through the Deschutes River like gold dust scattered by wind. Spring had officially arrived, bringing warmth-blooming dogwoods and a subtle hum of energy that filled the town with restless movement. But within the cozy tile-floored hallways of Elm Street Veterinary Clinic, something far more curious was stirring a quiet revolution, unfolding not in protest or debate, but in breath glance and inexplicable instinct. Sarah Whitmore stood by the observation room, arms crossed over her chest, watching Sonny through the two-way glass. The little golden retriever was lying down, paws tucked under his chest, staring calmly into the center of the room. His tail thumped slowly now, and then not out of boredom, but expectation. Sarah's assistant, Glenn Moretti, leaned beside her. Glenn was a 30-something man, with a kind, round face, faint stubble, and an ever-present green beanie. A former EMT turned vet tech, Glenn had a sharp memory for detail and a deep love for jazz and reptiles. He adjusted his glasses, blinking. He hasn't moved in 10 minutes, not even when I walked in. Sarah glanced at her notes. He's anticipating something. Again. He did the same thing yesterday before the UPS guy arrived. Glenn tilted his head. Do you think it's just hearing smell? I thought that 2 weeks ago, she muttered. Now I'm not sure what to think. She turned and walked down the corridor to Mason, who was compiling data into a spreadsheet in the small office they had temporarily converted into their observation hub. Mason looked up from his laptop, dark hair tied back loosely, eyes rimmed with fatigue but bright with curiosity. He's doing it again, he asked. Sarah nodded. 5 times this week. 3 distinct events before they occurred, one of which had no sound cues, one of which happened before the stimulus was even physically near the building. I've been digging, Mason said, turning his screen. Found some studies on electromagnetic sensitivity in canines. Nothing conclusive, but maybe he's perceiving localized shifts, minute field changes, static differentials, electrical patterns. Sarah raised an eyebrow. And how would he know those mean danger or people or grief? That, Mason said, closing the laptop is where science stops and something else begins. In the front lobby, Mira and Caleb were building what they called the Sonny Map, a sprawling timeline and diagram on the clinic's whiteboard with color-coded strings connecting events to moods, moon phases, weather shifts, and nearby EMF readings from a small handheld meter Mira had borrowed from her uncle, who believed in earth frequencies. A bell rang as the front door opened. A man entered, tall, mid-50s, wearing a battered brown jacket and worn jeans, his shoulders hunched against invisible weight. His face was lined skin, sallow eyes shadowed. He walked slowly, dragging a limp in his left leg. Under one arm was a pet carrier. Inside, something meowed weakly. This was Dr. Leonard Carver, a retired physicist who had once taught at Oregon State, but had withdrawn from public life after losing his wife 2 years ago. He had recently moved to Bend for quiet. He was not known to be warm nor particularly social, but Sarah knew his history. "What can we help you with today?" she asked gently as she approached. "My cat Huxley. He's not been eating. He hides in the closet." "I don't know what's wrong," Carver said with a little emotion. Mira, curious, peeked around the corner with Caleb. Sonny rose from where he'd been lying and walked silently toward the man. He stopped 2 feet away, then sat down, eyes locked on the carrier. Dr. Carver blinked. He's staring at the box. Sarah crouched to examine the cat, a slender Russian blue with dull fur and cloudy eyes. As she lifted him gently, Sonny let out a low, almost melodic whine. Mason stepped forward, notebook in hand. Sonny's only made that sound twice. Once when Caleb had that splinter in his foot. Once with the kitten that had early-stage hypoglycemia. Sarah's brow furrowed. "We'll do a scan." 20 minutes later, the ultrasound revealed an intestinal mass pressing against the cat's stomach, not visible from outside. No typical symptoms yet, caught just in time. Dr. Carver stood beside the counter, fingers trembling slightly. "How did your dog—" "He just feels things," Caleb said quietly. The older man turned, looking at Sonny, as if he were a question written in light. "That's impossible," he muttered, but the edge in his voice had softened. "I studied chaos theory my whole life, and even this is outside the formula." Sarah smiled. "Some truths aren't meant to be proven, only witnessed." The clinic wasn't the only place noticing. By now, stories about Sonny had begun circulating online, a blog post here, a local news snippet there. A small documentary student group from Portland reached out asking to film. Mason declined for now, but the sense of something larger brewing was undeniable. At school, Caleb found classmates asking about Sonny. Some wanted to pet him, others just watched. Even Liam, his skateboard-loving cousin, admitted, "Okay, your dog's like psychic or something. That's kinda awesome." One cloudy evening, Caleb brought Sonny to Pine Hollow Retirement Home, where June had been volunteering weekly. The facility smelled faintly of lemon polish and tulips. Sonny walked calmly beside Caleb as they entered the common room, filled with soft laughter, crocheted blankets, and old Frank Sinatra tunes on the radio. Residents looked up smiling. One woman, Miss Dottie Petite, with snow-white curls and a pink cardigan, was staring out the window. Sonny walked straight to her, rested his head on her lap. She didn't move at first. Then slowly she reached down and touched his fur. "I haven't touched a dog since 1984, she whispered. Tears welled in her eyes. "His name was Max. I forgot what his ears felt like." Caleb said nothing, just watched. Sonny's tail wagged once softly. Later, as they walked home beneath a silver dusk, Caleb looked down at his golden companion and said, "You don't just feel things, do you? You give them back." The wind had shifted over Bend, less playful now, more reflective. Late April had arrived with a hush, as if the trees themselves were waiting for something. The Deschutes River flowed quieter these days, mirroring the sky in still ripples. At the veterinary clinic and in the hearts of those closest to Sonny, something deep had begun to stir. Not fear, not awe exactly, but a strange kind of reverence. Mason sat in his truck outside the clinic, hands resting on the steering wheel. He had barely slept. The night before, Sonny had woken him with a bark, not loud, but urgent. Mason had found the dog standing on his bed, staring not at the door, but at the corner of the room, unblinking. There had been nothing there, no sound, no scent, just stillness. But Mason felt something too, a pressure in his chest like standing on the edge of a truth he couldn't name. Inside the clinic, Caleb and Mira were preparing for what they called the empathy experiment. It wasn't scientific by formal standards, but it had structure. Mira had drawn up emotion cards, each marked not with words, but colors and abstract shapes. She believed Sonny responded more to energy than expression. Caleb was in charge of the environment, temperature, light, sound, ensuring that no external variables interfered. Mason would log observations, while Sarah, standing back like a watchful sentinel, monitored vitals and behavioral cues. They'd invited a special guest for this test, Dr. Mariana Solano, a neuroscientist from Portland, who had read about Sonny through a veterinary forum. Mariana was in her early 40s with bronze skin, short black curls, and eyes that seemed always to be measuring what couldn't be seen. She wore a charcoal pantsuit and flat leather boots, her presence quiet but commanding. She had spent years researching sensory processing in animals, and though skeptical, she was curious. "So," she said, placing her tablet on the table, I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here to observe without bias. Let's see if your golden boy has more than instinct." Sonny entered the room, ears up, tail, swaying eyes, calm. He sat in the center of the observation mat and waited. No command, no leash, just presence. Mira selected the first card, blue spirals, surrounded by red points, and held it in her lap, focusing on the emotion it represented. Grief. She didn't speak, didn't move. The room fell silent. Sonny's posture shifted. He stood, walked slowly toward Mira, and pressed his head against her knee. She exhaled sharply, blinking tears she didn't know she had. "That wasn't sadness," she said quietly. "That was my dad's funeral. I was thinking about the last thing he said to me." Dr. Solano wrote something down. "Let's continue." Card after card, emotion after emotion, Sonny responded not always with touch, but with movement, body position, vocalizations. When Mira focused on fear, Sonny whined softly and circled the room. When Mason silently, with no card, thought about the night of the accident that took his parents, Sonny lay down beside him without being called. Caleb, watching all of this unfold, felt the weight of something ancient pressing through the quiet, something more primal than training, deeper than memory. Sonny wasn't reading minds. He was translating something beyond language. That afternoon, Dr. Solano remained behind with Mason as the others went home. "He's not telepathic," she said, tapping her stylus on the edge of her tablet. "But he's absolutely responding to shifts in emotional fields. If I had to guess, his brain is wired with a hyper-developed limbic response system, paired with high olfactory mapping. But even then, it doesn't explain everything." "Then what does Mason?" asked. Dr. Solano smiled faintly. "Maybe nothing we've invented yet." That night, Mason walked with Sonny into the pine woods. No trail, no leash, just the rhythm of boots and paws over soft earth. They came to a clearing Mason hadn't visited in years, his grandmother's favorite spot. An old wooden bench still stood beneath a hawthorn tree, moss curling over its legs. Mason sat. Sonny stood in front of him. "Why me?" Mason whispered. "Why you?" Sonny looked up then, without warning, walked to the center of the clearing, turned and barked once. And then it happened. Mason's chest tightened, not with pain, but with presence. His mind filled with a memory, not entirely his own, a rushing river, the sensation of cold, a flash of fear, and a warmth like a light pulsing just behind his ribs. He gasped, blinking hard, and saw Sonny standing still, eyes locked to his. For a fleeting moment, Mason felt the world not as a man, but as something else, as if his thoughts had overlapped with Sonny's. There were no words, just knowing. A pulse of understanding. I was there. I remember. I chose to stay. Mason dropped to his knees, not in worship, in gratitude. They walked back in silence. The next day, Mason brought a single photograph to the clinic. It was taken 2 weeks before the bridge incident. A sketch his grandmother had drawn and left inside one of her journals. It showed a boy kneeling beside a golden dog under a hawthorn tree. The caption read, "Sometimes the ones we're meant to save find us first." No one spoke when he showed it to them. They didn't need to. The town of Bend awoke to sunlight that felt different, not just warm, but somehow meaningful, as if the light itself carried a memory. Spring was in full bloom. The riverbanks were green, the dogwoods heavy with white blossoms, and birdsong filled the mornings like a hymn. But beneath the familiar rhythm of the town, a quiet shift had taken hold. People had begun to speak in softer tones when talking about a certain dog. Not as a curiosity now, but as a presence, a kind of living light. Mason pulled his truck into the gravel lot of Pine Hollow Elementary, where a large white banner flapped in the wind, "Sonny's Light, a Day of Connection." It was a small event, hastily organized but deeply felt. Hosted by the clinic, the local library, and the Jennings family, the gathering was meant to celebrate community compassion, and something no one could fully name, but everyone believed in. Children spilled across the lawn in clusters, painting rocks, planting saplings, writing cards for residents at Pine Hollow Retirement Home. Tables were lined with hand-drawn posters, photos of animals rescued by Sonny's instincts, and messages like, "Feel first, be still, listen, and love knows without words." A wooden sign carved by a local carpenter read, "You don't need to speak to be heard." Sonny. Caleb stood at the center of it all, wearing a sky blue shirt and a pin that simply said, "Companion." Sunny sat beside him, tail wagging, slowly eyes half closed, as if soaking in more than sunshine. June was there too, standing near the community storytelling tent, where she was collecting audio recordings of people's experiences with Sunny. Her cardigan was sunflower yellow, and she smiled more than she had in years. "Have you seen Mira?" Caleb asked Mason, brushing grass from his notebook. "She's over by the violin booth," Mason replied, nodding toward the far edge of the field. Mira stood under a blossom-laden cherry tree, playing slow, delicate notes that drifted through the park like threads of memory. She wore a pale dress today instead of her usual patched jeans, and her face was calm, centered. Around her, animals rested: a senior husky, a rescued parrot in a travel cage, a box turtle with a name tag reading Benedict. They all listened. Sarah Whitmore walked among the crowd with Glenn at her side, her coat exchanged for a simple linen shirt and wide-brimmed hat. She looked both out of place and exactly where she belonged. People greeted her as if she were more than a vet now, something of a steward to the mystery they'd all come to accept. At midday, the mayor of Bend arrived: Carolyn Tate, a tall woman in her early 60s with streaked gray hair, a firm handshake, and a surprising affection for poetry. She stepped up to the makeshift stage and smiled into the crowd. "We gather today not for spectacle," she began, "but for remembrance of what lives between us even when we fall silent." Sunny reminds us of that. Not by tricks, not by training, but by being what we often forget to be: open, a heart without defense. She looked down at Sunny, who had padded over to sit at the foot of the stage. "We honor him today," she continued, "not just for the lives he's touched, but for the way he's changed how we see the lives around us." The crowd applauded gently, not the loud kind, but the kind that lingers like warmth. After the speech, a moment was held for reflection. Children wrote messages on paper leaves and pinned them to a wooden sculpture of a tree at the center of the field. One girl, no older than 6, wrote, "Thank you for finding my brother when he got lost. I think you're magic." That afternoon, a final surprise unfolded. Sarah, who had been quietly coordinating behind the scenes, unveiled a new initiative: the Sunny Project, a community center designed to bring together children and therapy animals focused on emotional wellness and interspecies connection. The building would be named Sunny's Light. Caleb blinked back tears. "We're building something real." Mira grinned. "It already exists. The building just gives it a shape." Later, Mason stood with Caleb near the bench where it had all started. He placed something in the boy's hand, a small compass on a leather string, old and scuffed. "My grandmother gave this to me," Mason said. "She said it didn't point north, it pointed home. I think it's yours now." Caleb held it heart full. As the sun began to set, coloring the sky in deep gold and lavender, the crowd gathered for the last time, circling around Sunny in silence. One by one, they touched his head, his fur, his paw, like pilgrims laying down burdens. Some laughed, some cried. Some simply stood with eyes closed, and Sunny, quiet, still radiant, sat in the middle, the light catching in his golden coat like it had waited its whole life for this hour. When the evening ended, Caleb whispered to Sunny as they walked home through the grass, "You didn't just change us, you reminded us." Sunny looked up. His tail wagged once. He knew. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always begin in hospitals or therapy rooms. Sometimes it starts with a quiet moment, a gentle touch, or a second chance. A forgotten dog, a lonely man, and a child without a home found each other not through perfection, but through presence. In our daily lives, we all pass by people or animals who are quietly asking for help. What would happen if we paused and listened? If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs a little light today. Leave a comment below about the moment that touched you most. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story like this. What does healing mean to you? Let us know in the comments.